All right, so let's talk about revenue. You'd think it's simple, right? You make a sale, you count the cash. Easy. But what happens when that sale comes with a bunch of strings attached, like, say, a future discount or an extended warranty? What if you don't even get paid in cash, but in company stock? See, the real world is messy. It's full of all these tricky scenarios. And that, honestly, is where it gets really interesting. Which brings us to the big question. When is a sale actually a sale? I mean, is it the moment the contract is signed? Or maybe when the product leaves the warehouse? Or is it not a real sale until the money is physically in your bank account? You can see how getting this wrong could completely mess up a company's financial picture. And that's precisely why we have a rulebook for this stuff. It's called ASC 606, and it's all about making sure everyone is playing by the same rules. So, here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at the main rulebook. Then, we'll cover what's not in the book. After that, we'll dive into what happens when the price gets complicated, figure out what's really being promised in a deal, and wrap it all up with the most important part, timing. Okay, so our guide through all this complexity is something called ASC 606. Think of it as the official playbook for recognizing revenue in the US. And its entire mission, really, is to get every company on the same page. So when you look at their financial statements, you're actually comparing apples to apples. And if you want to boil the entire massive standard down to one sentence, this is it. The core idea is to recognize revenue in a way that shows the transfer of goods or services for the amount you expect to get. Notice what it's doing there. It's shifting the whole focus. It's not about when did we get paid anymore. It's all about when did the customer actually get what they paid for. Every single rule we're about to go through is just trying to answer that one question. All right, but before we dive headfirst into all the rules, we need to talk about what's not covered. ASC 606 is a big deal, but it doesn't apply to every single transaction out there. Knowing what's out of scope is just as important as knowing what's in. And here are the big ones. You've got things like lease contracts, insurance contracts, and all sorts of financial instruments. These are such specialized areas that they have their very own dedicated rulebooks. So ASC 606 just kind of steps back and says, you guys got this. Same goes for most guarantees and these interesting non-monetary exchanges. Like, when two oil companies just swap inventory to make their lives easier, ASC 606 doesn't touch that stuff. Okay, so now that we know what's not in the book, let's jump into our first real headache, figuring out the price. I know, it sounds simple. How much did the customer pay? But believe me, it gets complicated fast, especially when you start throwing in things like bonuses, rebates, or potential refunds. And a huge reason for that complication is something called variable consideration. This is any part of the price that isn't fixed. You see it everywhere. A bonus for finishing a project ahead of schedule, a rebate for a customer who buys a ton of product, or even usage fees for a cloud service. The final price tag is a big question mark. So what do? Well, you have to estimate it. You either figure out the most likely amount you'll get, or you calculate an expected value based on a range of possibilities. But, and this is a really important but, there's a major catch. It's called the constraint. Basically, you can't just go and book all the revenue you think you might get. That's a recipe for disaster. ASC 606 puts the brakes on and says, hold on, you can only recognize that variable revenue if it's highly probable that you won't have to reverse it later. It's a huge reality check, really. It stops companies from getting too optimistic and booking revenue that might just disappear. And the complexity doesn't stop with variable consideration. There are a few other pricing wrinkles to iron out. First, if you get paid way before or way after you deliver the goods, we're talking more than a year, you have to adjust for the time value of money. Second, what if you're not paid in cash? Maybe you get paid in stock. You've got to figure out its fair value. And third, what if you pay the customer? Yeah, that happens. Think about paying a supermarket for prime shelf space. That payment is almost always seen as a reduction of your transaction price, not a separate expense. So, let's say we've wrestled the transaction price to the ground. We have our number. The next big job is to figure out what exactly did we promise to do for that money. Because a single contract isn't always a single promise. It can be a whole bundle of them, what the standard calls performance obligations. And we have to unbundle them and account for each one on its own. And one of the first questions you have to ask is, are we the principal or the agent here? This is a huge distinction. The principal is the one who actually controls the good or service before it gets to the customer. The agent just sets up the deal. And why does this matter so much? Well, the principal gets to report the entire sale price as revenue. That's gross revenue. The agent, they only report their commission or fee. That's net revenue.
It makes a massive difference to how big your company looks on paper, and it all boils down to that one word: control. Warranties can be tricky too. You have to figure out if it's an assurance type warranty or a service type one. An assurance warranty is the basic guarantee that your product isn't a dud. It works like it's supposed to. That's just a potential expense for the company. But a service type warranty, that's when you sell something extra, like an extended warranty. That's a whole separate promise to the customer, a separate performance obligation. And that means you have to slice off a piece of the sales price and recognize that revenue over the life of that extended warranty.
Okay, what about licensing, like software or a brand logo? Here, the big split is between a right to use and a right to access. A right to use is for things like off-the-shelf software. The customer gets it, it works, and they get the value right then and there. So you recognize the revenue at a single point in time. But a right to access is different. Think about licensing a famous brand. The value of that brand depends on the owner constantly promoting it and keeping it popular. The customer is benefiting from those ongoing activities. So in that case, the revenue gets recognized over time.
All right, this brings us to the grand finale, the step where it all comes together: timing. We've figured out the price, we've identified all the promises, now we have to decide when we actually get to put that revenue on our books. And really, it boils down to two choices. Do we recognize it gradually, over time, or all at once, at a single point in time?
And the deciding factor, the one word that determines everything, is control. That's it. Revenue gets recognized at the moment the customer gains control of the good or service. The second they can decide how to use it and get all the benefits from it, that's when the transfer happens, and that's when you book the revenue.
So when does that happen over time? Well, ASC 606 gives us a 3-point checklist. You recognize revenue over time if any of these are true. First, if the customer is getting and using the benefit as you're doing the work. Think of a monthly streaming subscription. Second, if your work creates an asset that the customer already controls, like if you're building an extension on their house. And third, if you're building something super specific for them that you couldn't sell to anyone else, and you have the right to get paid for the work you've done so far if they cancel. Hit any one of those, and you're recognizing revenue over time. And what if you go through that whole list and the answer is no, no, and no? Then the default answer kicks in. You recognize the revenue at a single point in time. It's that one specific moment when control officially passes to the customer. You know, like handing over the keys to a new car.
So when you step back and look at the big picture, you can see how all these little rules, all these nuances about pricing and warranties and timing, they're not just there to make life difficult. They all serve one single purpose. They're all part of a system that's trying to make sure that the final revenue number on a financial statement actually reflects the real value that was transferred to the customer.
So what does this all mean for you? Well, the next time you're looking at a company's earnings report, don't just glance at that big revenue number at the top. Think about what we've talked about. Ask yourself, what story is that number really telling me? Is that gross or net revenue? How much of that is based on an estimate? How much of it was recognized over time, plus all at once? Because now you know the rules, you can start to see beyond the number itself and understand the real story behind it.